Hello, friends, and welcome to Ask Xact. Today we have a field trip down at Xact Tone Solutions because I wanted to talk about, kind of the tone suck and tone obsession, because this is one of the things that in interviews or talking with friends, that it kind of comes up a lot, and they'll talk about how something is, tone sucking, or it's boosting their, when it's a delay pedal that's boosting or cutting and different things like that. And so kind of wanted to have a discussion, and I felt like if we were going to do this properly, we needed to have someone that could really kind of put it in more concrete, understandable terms instead of voodoo or just the kind of lame, pedantic terminology.
Right.
Is that fair? Is that fair?
Yeah. We'll see. Right.
Yeah. So
I'm always afraid it's always slightly unsatisfying when I have this conversation with folks, because even as we've discussed it in the past, it can kind of feel like you're just kind of going around the mountain again and again and again. And so we'll see if we can bring any sort of resolution to this thing.
Yeah, maybe there doesn't need to be a resolution. Maybe there just needs to be understanding.
Yeah, that would be good. I'd love to understand.
So, just to kind of give the nickel version of tone suck, if you go back to like, effects made in the 70s, like an old script logo Dynacomp, if you bypassed the thing, it sounded terrible because it would just, it sounded dark and of course it made you probably want to leave the effect on and not turn it off.
Right.
So then we get buffered bypass, and then we get into true bypass, which are kind of I guess the two different main ways of kind of trying to address this.
Now, when would you say is the peak of true bypass, as the historian that you are?
Oh, okay.
Because I remember nobody talked about it, and it feels like maybe in the aughts-ish, that became like a huge deal, where you were doing yourself, your family, your ancestors a disservice if you did not have true bypass.
I would. That's absolutely true. I would say by the late 90s, it started with the boutique companies. And I think part of it was a cost thing. I think, maybe it was in the design of the circuit. I don't know. What do you think about that? Where it seemed like they started using these switches and touting that. Because, Full Tone and others were touting true bypass and using those type of mechanical switches as early as like 95 or such. And they were selling these things. But, and true
as far as circuits go, I wonder, I never really thought about it until just now, but once those 3-pole double throw switches came available, which made true bypass with indication really easy.
Right.
Now, as if you're just like a DIYer homebrewing these things, you don't need to know anything about FET switching or, analog switches that used to come in like a monolithic package, or flip-flops, or, whether discrete like what the Boss has, or, actual integrated flip-flops like the Nobles has. Like, you could just ditch all that stuff, which would be hard to do, like not on a circuit board and not with some understanding. And so cynical me kind of wonders if, well, we don't know how to do buffered bypass. We do know how to do true bypass now, because I can just draw a wiring diagram and do it. So I get the benefit. There's a double benefit. I can kind of put down what was, which might be even more technically difficult in some ways, and I can tout this thing as the better option.
Yeah, I think there's an element to that of the kind of explosion of true bypass, and how everyone started asking. By the late 90s, everyone was asking, "Is it true bypass or not?"
And we still get that.
Yeah. And so I guess now everyone. A lot of guys have done like little tests and stuff like that. Like I've done testing where you have a sizable board, maybe it's 10 to 12 pedals, and you have them where it's all true bypass, or you have it where it's all buffered. And both of them, when you get to that level of extremism, it's problematic. Because when you have 10 to 12 true bypass pedals that are all off and nothing is acting in any way, shape, or form as a buffer by being on, whether it's an overdrive or a delay or what have you. I mean, there's a lot of capacitance and it's an odd thing. It's not great. And then if you have that many buffers, if you have 12 buffers, and of course, sometimes it's weird, you know, depending, it was even more weird when all the buffers were made by the same manufacturer. And it seemed like
compounding.
It seemed to compound the issue of where certain frequencies were hyped more, and it just didn't. It seems like it's really difficult to have a truly flat buffer.
Yeah, I think looking at it on paper, it's not too hard. One thing that I think often gets overlooked, and maybe you were talking about this before, maybe it's just another conversation we had before. Sometimes it's not just frequency range, like the ODR1 and the Mostortion, you're passing through FETs that are being used as switches. And I think one of the reasons why some rehouses of those people, I mean, because we've had our guys come in and be like, I had this rehoused and they wrecked it. And what they did was they pulled out all those switching FETs and replaced them with a piece of wire, which should be one for one. You look,
right.
This FET is acting like a switch, and when the pedal is on, it should be closed. So I'm just going to jump that with a piece of wire. The problem is that the FET isn't a perfect switch, particularly as you are shoving signal through it. So it might be flat frequency-wise in their frequency band of interest, which is not, you know, super wideband for guitar, but the FET's distorting. And so you hear that, and you might interpret that if it's kind of distorting in the mid-range, you might hear that as a limiting of mid-range and or a boosting of bass and high, because those aren't getting limited, because basically you've got a multi-band compressor at that point. And so this thing for small signals is flat, but as you start to hit it with more signal, it's doing this multi-band compression thing, and at the very least aurally, it sounds like it's hyping something. And I think if you did that in particular, if you had a string of those together, you would hear that effect compounded totally.
Yeah. You know, at the end of the day, everything affects everything to an extent. And so it's like because I've messed with Mostortion pedals a lot over the last 15 years, and I've played through a lot of the different copies and such, and it makes a difference if you have it true bypass or not, or whether it's got the same type of, you know, switching and buffer in there. It changes the sound of the pedal. And so some might like it better, but it doesn't sound like the original when you true bypass it anymore.
Yeah. I would say you can like when we true bypass those, we basically trick the pedal into being on in its original state. And then all we do is basically, you could think of the pedal as being in a true bypass loop inside of itself.
Right.
But the circuit itself, you're still running through, for better and worse.
Yeah.
You're running through all this stuff that really is ostensibly just there for switching, except it never switches again for the rest of its life.
And that's the better way of doing it, because you're able to preserve the real sound of it, yet you're able to completely bypass it.
Yeah. And so that was, you know, that seemed, as we were looking at the problem where guys were bringing things in and saying, hey, this doesn't sound the same anymore. Some of these things, and maybe we'll get more into this later, some of these tone suck things, we have to deal with like the psychology of it. So one of the reasons we do what we do for things like rehouses or even other things, I think it applies to that, is to remove, if I deliver something to you, a Mostortion, and you say, man, this sounds different, I need to be able to give an account for what we did, and at the very least reassure you that I don't know how that could be, right? Because we didn't change. You're running through all the same stuff. So hypothetically, you don't like running through the new jacks with this switch, with this mechanical switch, but that would have to be it. And maybe that's enough to sort of quell, well, okay, I guess it really can't be that different. And so that can be helpful, especially if somebody ships us in something from Japan, and we mod it and we send it back and they're like, well, it changed. And I'm like, well, if it did, we changed it the absolute minimum to be able to give it the function that it has. The corpus, the core of what that thing is, we left completely untouched. Yeah. And we just kind of remoted it in one sense or the other. So that sort of pre-work is sometimes necessary depending on the client and how sensitive they are to even the concept of change. Because like as we've talked about, that suspicion that something is different can be just as insidious as something actually changing.
Yes. And that's one of the important lessons that I've learned, from you and Joe Glazer and people that work on any aspect of musicians' gear, is that the psychology of it is really important, because you're really treating the person as much as you are the gear. Mm-hmm. So going back to like the crude testing that I did with, all true bypass pedals and all buffered pedals, one of the things I noticed with the all buffered setup was it seemed like the tone didn't really get bad, but it changed the way the guitar felt as you played it. And I know that's getting like way off into the ether some, but some of that's explained by what you were talking about when the buffer is doing different things and you're getting a compression or a lack thereof. And it goes from feeling where it has a compression to it or softness to it, or maybe it's an EQ thing where you're hearing frequencies that you weren't hearing before, and that changes the way it feels when you're playing.
Yeah, so like those buffers, like a lot of those buffers are just like a transistor, like a single transistor buffer, and that's going to have some sort of harmonic distortion, right? And when maybe this is it, I've not measured it to verify, but if you think of harmonic distortion as sort of spreading the energy out over the spectrum, as you do that, I think you can lead to sort of softness. Because if you I remember one pedal company, they were doing some wave shaping things where they could give you a ton of second order by design, a second order distortion. And we've been told by tube purists and all that, like second order is great. But if you take that and you add a ton of second order, it basically is an octaver, and everything starts to feel softer. And so if you take that same harmonic structure, that harmonic distortion, repeat it again and again and again and again, even though it's slight in the one case, it's multiplicative, right? So you're applying the same function to that signal over and over and over again. And so then you're hyping what the little thing that it did, that 0.1%, you multiply that by 10 times, and now you've got 1 part in 100. And I think the more you do that, the more people are able to detect, that difference. So that makes sense. I think it is really tough. And when I first met Greg here, he really, he does such a good job of, because I had no sense of feel. I was strictly like a sound, because I'm not a real player. If it sounded right, that was good enough. Mm-hmm. And then as I started interacting with players who were much, much better than I was, and began to realize that feel was a thing, and then working with Greg, who would show me, listen, this is what this is doing, and then playing the lick, and then you can kind of annex somebody else's feel and get a sense. That's a real thing. People should feel secure in, don't let anybody tell you feel's not real. because it is, and it's a real part of, it's a dynamic thing typically, although EQ can really change perceived feel. Because if I slam the high end out of something, it's going to feel softer because it's not going to feel as fast or as clicky or because I just took it like this, and now all of a sudden it feels that inarticulation can kind of translate to your right hand. Like it doesn't feel like it's responding the same, and that's a feel thing.
Yeah. And that makes total sense, because sometimes when you think, oh, this doesn't feel the same, and you think that something's going on with something killing the signal or compressing it or what have you, and really it can be purely an EQ thing, where it's just because it's hyping the high end or something, it feels harder.
Yeah.
Or if it's cutting the high end, all of a sudden it feels softer.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like purely an EQ thing. That's the strange thing about these systems, is it's almost never purely anything.
Yeah.
It's not, we want it to be, right?
Yeah.
We want it to be like, oh, you've got the wrong X, swap this piece out, and then the stars align and everything starts looking again or working again. But because everything is sort of, maybe we were talking about this before, it's like Play-Doh, and you've got these different colors and you start mashing them together. You can't really tease out anymore what's doing what. I mean, you can, like in the same way the colors would be like, well, the blue and the red, like the blue is making it more purpley. Like you can do that, but you can't tease it out.
Yeah.
And have, it's kind of stuck in there now. And if you try to extricate it, you're going to change what it is. And in some ways, I feel like that's kind of a bummer, because it feels kind of like hopeless, like you can't change anything. But in some other ways, I feel like it kind of is what it is. And in that way, you can just kind of let it go. Be like, okay, I like this. It is what it is.
Yeah. And I think part of this goes back to a lot of the true bypass marketing and such was that, it's like when you turn it off, it sounds like you're plugged straight into the amp.
Mm-hmm.
And
with a switch and 2 extra jacks.
Right. Exactly. it is changing things. But it seemed like it was more subtle, especially when you were doing a test where it was one pedal.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think what it comes down to is that you're never, as soon as you start inserting anything between the guitar and the amp, it changes things. And so it's like, if you want the sound of a guitar plugged straight into an amp, well, you have to have the guitar plugged straight into the amp.
Yes.
And there's no way around it.
Yes.
To a degree.
Yeah. I mean, I think technically that's true. And again, it's kind of a bummer, because it's like, well, then I can't have anything. You just... Every person, every player has to kind of decide how nuts do you want to be about this.
And being nuts is okay to a degree. Mm-hmm. But I think, like, one of the things we have to make kind of make these compromises and decision as players and such is that, okay, what do I have to have? If I'm just, what do I have to have for the gig that I'm playing?
Yes.
And so if you have to have a lot of different gags and a bunch of different sounds, well, then you kind of got to have some kind of multi-effect unit or a bunch of pedals or whatever it is. And you just kind of have to work with it.
Yeah.
We were talking on the phone the other day, and I was talking about, a situation that, from 20 plus years ago, where during my time, working with Brad Paisley, we started obsessing over, okay, which one of the wireless units sounds just like cable plugged straight into the amp. And basically there wasn't anything.
Especially then.
Yeah, especially then. And we had what was at the time top of the line, wireless units by Sennheiser and Shure. And at the end of the day, because Brad was never going to do a show without a wireless, because he goes all over the stage. Mm-hmm. And there was one time where we were playing near a military base, and there was like it was like even before the show, I knew we were screwed, because there was only like 1 or 2 frequencies that were working.
Right.
And I knew it. And so I had 100-foot cable, and I knew I was going to get screwed. And so, of course, about the second or third song,
with 100 feet of cable, that telly was about to get screwed too.
Exactly. It ended up that about probably 2 or 3 songs in, of course, the guitar went out. Mm-hmm. The wire, the frequency got stomped on, and so he picks the guitar up like this. And I go over there and I take, and I unplug the wireless and plug in the 100-foot cable. And then he thinks it's fun to start, going around mic stands and things like that. And he's laughing the whole time.
Right.
So, but again, I tell that story just to say that there's so many times where you have things that you have to have, and you just kind of have to, compromise with it. And then this obsession over tone and things like that is really part of, in a lot of these guys, not all of them, but in a lot of them, it's the same obsession that made them the great guitar players that they are.
Yes.
And so it's just like the way they're going to be over-prepared for the gig, and they're going to know everything backwards and forwards. They're also being just as methodical when it comes to their rig, and that they're going to be like, oh, this delay pedal is giving me a 3% boost when I turn it on. Mm-hmm. Or worse, it's giving me, a 5% cut or something like that when I turn it on. Or this tuner, I think I'm losing, 3% or whatever it is. Yeah. But there's these little things that and so then they spend all this time finding, okay, what tuner can I live with? Because I have to have a tuner. Or am I not going to use a tuner and I'm going to use one of those clip-on tuners on the guitar?
Yeah. I remember JD did that a ton back when he was like cable into Marshall. Yeah. Like the tuner was there to be plugged in later. Yeah. Like when you needed it, because it screwed things up.
Yeah, it's like I think there's like an internet meme where someone's talking about Derek Trucks, and he had this, one of those old Korg rack tuners on top of his amp, and guys ask him, how do you get your signal to the tuner? And he unplugs the guitar from the amp and he plugs it into the tuner, and then he unplugs it from the tuner and plugs it into the amp.
Yep.
So there is part of this that's just kind of normal and part of kind of the same obsession that makes someone. But there's always times where it can go too far.
Yeah, like I was thinking about it this morning coming in. They're in the same way that, like if you're talking about like physically getting ready for like a sporting of, like if you play soccer or football or baseball or something like that, that sort of obsession that you would have with understanding the sport and in preparing for it and like getting your body physically ready, there's a lot of that drives a lot of good behaviors, right? But then you've got like this body dysmorphia where every time you look in the mirror, you're like I just can't see myself for who I am, and that manifests in all sorts of deleterious ways. So I think there's a lot of people out there who have sort of rig dysmorphia.
Yeah.
And they look down at their rig and be like, man, if I could just get this thing, then I would be happy. And then they get that thing and they're not happy because it moves on to some other thing. It's like, oh, if I could just I've got to have wireless, but if I can't get $8,000 together for a Shure Accent, I mean, that would really do it. Like if I could just get to that level, or if I could get this amplifier. And so there's this same sort of mental perversion of what could be a helpful drive to really pay attention, really care, know your parts, know the timbre that you're going for, but then you just get bogged down in this very critical, unproductively critical sort of way of looking at your world, to the point where now you're not even playing, right? So like you've stopped playing because you're worried, like, oh, I was going to play today, but instead I'm going to redo my board for the 18th time this month. And you never play anymore.
Yeah, and that's really the kind of extreme example of where the tone obsession becomes unhealthy, when it becomes, I'm spending so much more time obsessed over my tone when part of being able to get a good sound is practicing and playing and gigging and things like that. And so it's one of these things where you almost want to try to have some kind of balance with it, where you kind of where you expect the obsession,
or just care.
That's great. Or
like maybe just it is obsession, I think. And two, like, again, cynically, like what we do here at XTS depends on the sort of striving that the average guitar player goes through. Like,
absolutely.
We need you folks out there to want to do a new rig. If everybody was happy with everything that they had forever, nobody would make new pedals, nobody would buy new pedals, nobody would need new rigs built. We wouldn't need to talk about it on YouTube.
Nope.
We'd all become accountants.
We'd all just be happy and full of joy.
Right, we would be happy. That's probably a good thing. We would all be happy and accountants. But now we don't know how to account, so we do this, and we're willing to be miserable.
So part of one of the things that's and I'm sure you run into this also, is that I've done a lot of interviews and I'm around a lot of guitar players all the time, and so you're always getting this stuff is always being discussed. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems is that once you hear something, you can't unhear it.
Yes.
And so there's times when you are just blissfully going along and you kind of even know that you have a pedal that's doing something funky, but you're just kind of like I have on my board that y'all built, on both of them, I have a Line 6 Echo Park on there. And so it's true bypass, but as soon as you turn it on, the tone gets a little thinner, and it's like, and I just kind of like, whatever. I kind of knew it, but I didn't want to think. But then it's like
I didn't want to think about it. I was able to put it out of my mind.
I was able to put it out of my mind. And then you have friends that like I have a friend.
There's your problem right there. You have friends. I've avoided that complication in my life by not having any.
So then I have a friend that his name rhymes with J.D. Simon, and so he's been obsessed about tuners, and so we've been talking about that. And so, and then, we started talking about delay pedals and things like that. And so then I ended up, grab this. So just as a little fun side thing, I threw this together, over the weekend, because this was a tuner that JD felt like it was
approved,
doing a better bypass, which,
Well, I mean, I'll say JD brought the tuner saga in here.
Yeah.
And we listened to tuners.
Yeah.
And he's not wrong.
Right.
Does it matter to everybody? I mean, we put a lot of tuners on boards and nobody's known the difference. But we sat out there and played, and how he plays, what he was playing, the amp set as it was set, there is a small difference. And so we built him a box to sort of switch things away. This has a like a 3-pole double throw, if I remember correctly. So this is the least offensive. And like when we look at those switches, we think like, if you draw that switch, like even the schematic, it's got this thing that toggles between two sections. And this part of the switch is supposed to be 0 ohms, and there's no connection between the one that it's not connected to in that pole. But if you were to draw that in reality, there'd be capacitors going between each one, and there'd be a resistance here, and then there's a huge resistance between these two. So you'd like to think of these things as sort of pure, platonic, archetypal, perfect things, but they're not.
Yeah.
But can you get something that is honest enough that you can't detect it? Because basically, if you're A/Bing something and you can't identify it more than 50% of the time, then you don't know. Because a monkey can get 50% between two choices, just randomly picking.
Yeah.
So and we do that test here a lot. We'll do it with Greg, who's got a great capacity for like aural memory and detection. And we know that if we get it to where none of us in the shop can tell more than 50% of the time, then you can't tell.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll get it, sometimes you won't get it. And once you're to that point, it's ambiguous enough that they're close enough that you can't detect it. Now, like we've talked about before, that's for that one scenario that you're testing it in. Maybe that's clean guitar. Now, do you do it again on lead, on rhythm,
and when you
double stops, like that sort of thing?
Yeah. And then whether you have another effect on, all of a sudden it becomes a different thing. So I just kind of put this together kind of as just kind of a fun minimalist thing where it's basically, 3 effects in a tuner, and they're all supposed to be, pretty decent as far as the bypass is on them because I'm assuming these are relay bypasses on the Strymons.
Yeah. I mean, it's like we say pretty decent, and it's like now I don't know anything anymore. But yes, these are relay bypass. So this switch is really just like the same like functional switch. It's not a keyboard switch, but just like a keyboard switch, it's just closed when I press it.
Yeah.
Pressing this switch reroutes signals inside the body of this switch. Same for this switch.
Yeah.
This switch has no audio going through it. It sends basically a signal to a tiny little computer inside that tells a relay that is handling the audio to do the thing. And that should be pretty good. But if you look at a relay, the way it's physically constructed is the contacts are all super close together. You can have more capacitive interaction. So, and again, I don't say that to undermine anybody's, faith in the system.
Right.
But just to highlight the fact that it's just a really cruel world out there. And the final arbiter is how it sounds to you, how it plays, how it feels, and that sort of overarching philosophy of how obsessed or how much care what's good enough.
Yeah.
Everybody's got to decide what's enough.
Yeah. So let's get concrete as far as like what do you guys recommend, like when you're putting rigs together. I mean, do you like to have like one buffer and then everything else is going through loops or something like that? Let's say you're building a rack or like what's your ideal scenario when you're building a rig and you're thinking about buffers and loops and different things like that?
Yeah, we actually tend not to think about it in those terms because we don't want to necessarily apply the same methodology to everybody. So this may sound like a cop-out, but if you come in and you want to build something, our first question will be, are you happy with what you've got?
Right.
And if you say, yes, I love this, then we are going to do everything in our power to not change anything.
Right.
If you say, man, I feel like when I play, like it's like it gets a little darker, and I feel like the more stuff that I add, it gets even darker. I'm like, okay, well let's try a buffer.
Yeah.
Maybe you like that, or there'll be other things like I've got a vintage Dynacomp, and I like it when it's not. I feel like when I put that in the rig, when I have the compressor on, it's great, but when I turn it off, it sounds terrible.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that makes from experience, we have a heuristic for, okay, maybe we need to true bypass that or put it in a true bypass loop if you don't want to screw up something vintage. So we try to be very responsive.
And don't fix what isn't broken.
Yes.
And or create a problem, because potentially you're going to create a problem if they're happy with the sound of it going through these buffers or true bypass or whatever. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you decide to fix it, and all of a sudden it sounds or feels drastically different than it did before. Then you've created a problem. You've created an unhappy customer.
Yeah, and then it can be difficult to claw. Well, one, again, it's the psychology thing, and I know you've interacted with this before, if not directly with people you've worked for. I know you've heard stories where when you've built something new and you bring it to somebody, that first impression for most guitar players, most artist types is super critical.
Absolutely.
If you crash and burn on that first impression, it is very, very difficult to come back.
Yeah.
So we want to, when we deliver something, we want it to feel like immediately like a huge win. And that's not to say that tweaks don't come after the fact as people spend more time with something and maybe, like, hey, this is a little different. Can we try something here? Yeah, we'll try a couple things. But if somebody plugs something in and they're like, this is not it, that's pretty tough to win the day after that, because the seed that there's this inception of it's not going to be right.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't.
Yeah.
So that the psychology of that is it's when all this mojo stuff becomes real is once the player gets involved and that seed of doubt or suspicion or even potentially distrust comes in, that all that tropical fish, carbon comp, true bypass, buffered, all that stuff gets crystallized into reality. Because if you don't feel secure, you don't play secure. If you don't play secure, you don't sound good. And now all that mojo stuff results in a roundabout way through the player's brain, results in them not sounding as good. Well, now it's real.
Yeah.
And it works conversely as well. If you feel like everything, it's like after you've washed the car and you've changed the oil, you've done everything you do to be a good car owner, and you get in that car and you're like, this is as good as it gets.
That's right. This is a fantastic car.
Yeah, I love this car. I'll never sell this car. But there's an analog for that in playing, and you're like, yeah, this is great. I couldn't be happier. And that's a good place to be.
And there's the psychology of having a piece of gear that breaks on you during a gig. Mm-hmm. And if it does it twice, it's kind of over.
It can be.
It can't, unless you just love it and you're just willing to keep going after it. But
we've got some guys who are in abusive relationships with Deluxe Memory Men.
Oh. Yes, I can see that.
That's
I can see that. Yeah,
they just keep going back to him, even though he keeps hurting them real bad.
Keeps hurting them, shutting down during the gig.
We've got guys who are like, I want to put a Deluxe Memory Man, and we're buddies with this client. I'm like, do you really want to do this? I feel like a counselor.
Yeah.
It's like, listen, don't go back to him.
Yes.
He's not treating you right. You deserve better. Here, try this Benson delay, please. This is a good man.
Yes. This will be faithful.
That's right. He's going to treat you right.
He will not beat you during the show.
Right. All right. So then we start doing things like putting them in true bypass loops and stuff like that, which is something like a restraining order, I guess.
Yeah.
You can just dump it at any point. But I think in general, we've certainly had examples of guys and gals who have had stuff that failed on them, and they were like super invested in it, and they've ditched the maker. Like, X, Y, and like, I don't want any pedal that's made by this company anymore. And it really is kind of unfounded. Because switches break and jacks break, and having an instrument you step on is going to have issues. But bad switch, case in point. But it's like once burned, you can be like, you just can't recover.
Yeah.
Some people can.
Yeah. So I'll just tell this real briefly. So this says bad switch on it, and that's because I was doing some work for Reggie Young's widow, and so Reggie kind of had the feeling if anything broke, if a pedal broke, he did not repair it. He just bought another one. So if a volume pedal,
was that for efficiency, or was that
was for his own peace of mind, and because he was like a double or triple scale, session musician,
it just wasn't worth it.
It wasn't worth it, and so he would just, if the volume pedal had any scratchiness to it, he just bought another Ernie Ball volume pedal. Mm-hmm. If anything went wrong, he just bought another one and put it to the side. Well, anyway, when I was helping her go through some things, and I saw this one and it said bad switch on it, and And she said, if you want that, you can take it. And I said, okay. And so
was it a bad switch?
No, it didn't. The switch wasn't bad. So I don't know, and I've tried to make it not work.
Yeah.
But it's worked every time for me. So anyway, I think
it's a wonder these switches work at all. They are sort of a Rube Goldberg machine.
Yes.
Like 3 contacts all slamming together around the same time and all that. Even the way they go like clack clack.
Yeah.
It's not confidence inspiring.
Well, and that goes back to, weren't these designed for to be passing AC signal? They're not even designed to be passing delicate DC or
I don't know. Certainly their market use at this point it's got to be pedal people using most of them.
I think these were designed to be hand actuated. They weren't even designed to be foot switches.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I certainly would believe you. Yeah. There's just so much going on in that switch. Like I broke them open to look at them and stuff. It's like part of me is again, like I said, it's a wonder they ever work. Yeah. And they're rated. Most of the ones that I've seen are rated for like 10,000 hits. Like your keyboard will be rated at 1 million.
Right.
Because it's such a comparatively simple device. So these things are gonna fail. It's just a matter of time. Sometimes they fail gracefully, which in my mind is they give you a warning.
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't. It's just the whole system is built on these. Some of them are very backwards sort of things, and we take for granted that they're even doing what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And foot switches can be like that. Like, oh, it's a switch. It's a hard switch. It's the same thing as a piece of wire. And it is for the most part. It just kind of depends on how microscopically you want to look at it or measure it.
Yeah. So if we had to distill this conversation down, and we had to, like an 8th grader's, little paper, and you got to have the closing paragraph that's just so perfectly tied up. It seems like there's a psychological aspect where you kind of have to find your own areas where you stay on the road and don't get into the ditch of not giving a crap, and also caring so much that you're not. That you're only concerned about your gear and you're not concerned about the playing or anything else.
Yeah.
And then, what else?
I think that's a great place to start. I think everything does matter.
Yeah.
To one extent or the other. If I've often said, a man with an argument is never at the mercy of a man with an experience. So if somebody comes in and tells me, this object X is doing Y, I have to say, okay, I don't understand how that could be, but let's look at it and see if it makes sense. If it's real to you, then it's real enough for us to look at. So there's that. Everything is real. There is a point of diminishing returns. Mm-hmm. I think in general, like you said, the obsessiveness any obsessiveness that's productive in the sense that it sort of moves you along in your hobby of guitar or vocation of guitar, that's sort of driving it, or giving you some ambition like for improving and playing, because sometimes the gear will drive that. You get excited about a new piece of gear and you find yourself, well, I played for 3 hours today because I got this new thing. Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But the other side of that is this sort of dysmorphia thing where it can be paralyzing for some folks, where what are the settings that I should be using for this box? Is this the right box? Should I be doing this? And then they're not playing and they're spending time, on Instagram or forums, things like that, trying to figure out what they're doing wrong, when the biggest thing that could probably use a tweak is actually playing the stuff. And so for those folks, I would just exhort to, there is a point where you can let this go and there's a bunch of counter examples out there of guys playing what is probably quantitatively crap gear, just garbage, and they sound great doing it.
Yeah.
And so, do I need this? Is this bringing me joy, or is this, kind of bringing me pain? Is this breeding content or discontent? And so I think the obsession thing, to actually sum it up and not drone on about it, it's good as long as it's productive. And the minute that anybody feels like, man, this is making guitar kind of suck for me, I'm enjoying this less, I think it's probably time to make an adjustment and make a change. Because that always kind of stinks, because we'll have famous people come in and at some point they're not having fun at all anymore, and it's just about this problem of guitar and all that. And that's what I feel like we're here to make that problem go away, so it can strictly be fun.
So you can just go out there and do shows and be happy and give those people that are watching a vacation. 'Cause that's what they're there for. And pay hundreds of dollars to have a disgruntled musician.
Just mad about everything. It doesn't make sense. And we've talked about this before. We work with a lot of folks who are doing this for a living, which necessarily invites compromise. Like I was thinking this morning, like I remember Tim Pierce was telling us, is like what a pedal, what an amp sounds like in a room is irrelevant to me. All that matters, what's real, is when I put a mic on it and record it, what does it sound like? I don't know what it sounds like until I do that, because that's his target application.
And that's fair.
And so if you're playing live and it's got to be mic'd, it's what it is in the PA, and what it is in your ears, because that's a huge wrinkle and not ideal, monitoring thing. We've already made these huge compromises. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't care, but I think it does frame, like it gives us boundaries for what are we really gonna examine here. So like if somebody could write it off and be like, well, it's I'm listening on in-ear monitors, I don't know why I'm bothering at all. I don't know why I'm spending so much time picking amps or whatever. And I don't think that's true.
No, and no matter whether you're using wedges or in-ears or whatever, it's having that holistic approach of like, how do I make it sound where, I can be happy with it? Mm-hmm. Where does it, maybe it doesn't sound like it does when I'm sitting in front of the amp, playing, but I'm able to find a good sound that I can listen to and I can work with it and I can be creative with it instead of being obsessing the whole time. This doesn't sound like when I'm sitting in front of the amp with my ears.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. Well, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you to Barry and all the guys at Xact.
Oh, my pleasure. Always good to have you here.
It's a treat. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.